In this chapter, we are going to introduce the nervous system. So, this will be the last chapter that's on exam 3, chapter 11. So, let's first go through the functions of the nervous system, kind of the general organization of it. So, first of all, it begins with a sensory receptor. And the sensory receptor could be simple or complex, and it detects a stimulus. In this case, the stimulus is the glass of water. So the retina is the receptor that sees the glass of water. There are sensory inputs that travel via afferent pathways towards the integration center. And an integration center acts as the control center. This would be the central nervous system, which includes the brain as well as the spinal cord. The central nervous system makes a decision and then sends a signal out to a muscle or a gland via the motor output, which travels via the efferent pathway to an effector, the muscle or gland, and that causes a response. In this case, that glass of water is going to be brought to the person's lips and they are going to quench their thirst. This slide is showing us the general organization of the nervous system. So the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord, and this will be discussed in the next unit in chapter 12. The peripheral nervous system is everything outside of the central nervous system. It includes the cranial nerves, the spinal nerves, and the ganglia. The way I like to think of the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves is that they are the wires in and out of the central nervous system. So they would, in fact, be responsible for carrying the afferent signal, which would be sensory, from the sensory receptor to the central nervous system. And then they would also be responsible in carrying the efferent signal, which is the motor pathway out to the muscle or the gland. And we will be discussing the peripheral nervous system in chapter 13 in the next unit. But we are responsible for the general organization of the nervous system, just not a lot of detail for the central and peripheral nervous system. So when we look at this flow chart, we can see the central nervous system shown here with the brain and the spinal cord. Its function is integrative and the control center. The peripheral nervous system is everything outside of that, which we're going to cover in chapter 13. And it includes the cranial nerves, which there are 12 of, and spinal nerves. And it's the communication lines between the CNS and the rest of the body. The part that begins at the sensory receptor is going to sense the stimulus. And once it senses that stimulus, that information is then transported via the sensory or afferent division to the central nervous system. The central nervous system decides what to do with it. It then takes that information back out through the peripheral nervous system to the motor or the efferent division. There's two divisions of the motor division. There's the somatic nervous system. So the word somatic is essentially referring to the skin of the human body. Because we're going to see a word later on in this chapter called soma, and it's not quite the same thing. So the somatic nervous system means it's voluntary. This is kind of what you learned about in chapter 9, where acetylcholine is going to stimulate skeletal muscles and they can contract. Other division of the motor division is the autonomic nervous system, and this is chapter 14, which we'll cover in the next unit. The autonomic nervous system is just like what it sounds. It's automatically controlled, so it causes the cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands to react. And it has two subdivisions called the sympathetic and parasympathetic. The sympathetic division, you may have heard before, is called the fight or flight division, and the parasympathetic is the rest or digest nervous system. Our next slide is going to show what are called neuroglia, and we have billions of cells in our nervous system. Many of them are called neuroglia, and they are supporting cells for the neurons. So they do many, many important things. The other way you can think of them as the glue of the nervous system. So the first four are all going to be in the central nervous system. The first one is called an astrocyte, which we see in this first diagram. It's the most abundant in the central nervous system. It has many processes that attach to capillaries and neurons. I like to think of it like the janitor of the central nervous system. So it cleans up the extracellular fluid environment. So let's say that there are neurotransmitters that have leaked out into the ECF. The astrocytes will clean those up in the central nervous system. The next one is called the microglial cell, and the microglial cell is also in the central nervous system. It's the defensive cells, and they act as phagocytes, which destroy bacteria. They monitor the health of the neurons. So we can think of them kind of like the immune system in the central nervous system. Because traditionally, the immune system is outside of the central nervous system. The third one in the central nervous system lines the cavities. And these cavities are called ventricles, which you will learn about more in chapter 12. But they line those, and they also line areas where there is cerebrospinal fluid. So that's what the CSF stands for. The fourth and final neuroglial cell in the central nervous system is what's called an oligodendrocyte. These oligodendrocytes produce a very important protein lipid structure called myelin, and they do this on multiple axons in the central nervous system. So they're kind of like what are called Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system. But it's important for you to remember which part of the nervous system they're going to be located in. So the last two in the peripheral nervous system are the satellite cells, and the satellite cells surround the cell body of the neuron. The second of those two neuroglial cells in the peripheral nervous system are the Schwann cells, and they're the ones that act like oligodendrocytes, but they also surround parts of the axon. And this is super key because they're responsible for allowing what are called action potentials to leap from node of Ranvier to node of Ranvier, which we're going to talk a lot about throughout this chapter.